Phoenix, Arizona, 2025. 70,000 fans on their feet as George Strait steps into the lights, steady and unmistakable. The king of country, exactly where he's always been. But midway through the set, something goes wrong. A flash of pain so sharp, it locks his body in place. A hand gripping the microphone stand just long enough to hide the truth. Did anyone notice the moment he almost fell? Did anyone realize this might have been the night his body finally said no? George steadies himself, forces a breath, and keeps singing as the crowd roars, unaware of the private battle unfolding on that stage. This isn't a story about fame or legacy. It's the story of a 73-year-old man fighting his own body and what it's costing him to keep going. The body's rebellion. The warning signs started appearing in ways so subtle that George himself didn't recognize them as warnings at all. Just minor annoyances that successful performers learn to ignore because the show must always go on. In his late 50s, around 2009, he began noticing a scratchiness in his throat after particularly demanding shows, a hoarseness that wouldn't completely fade even with rest. At first, he dismissed it as the natural consequence of singing 3-hour sets multiple nights per week for 30 years straight. Every professional vocalist deals with strain, but by 2011, during what should have been a routine rehearsal, his voice didn't just strain, it broke completely. Midway through a song he'd performed thousands of times, the notes cracked and then collapsed entirely into painful silence. The band stopped playing, and in that awful quiet, George felt something close to panic, because his voice wasn't just his career, it was the tool through which he processed every loss, every grief, every moment of his life that words alone couldn't capture. The doctor's diagnosis was severe laryngitis, but the warning that followed hit harder than the diagnosis itself. If you push through this without proper treatment and rest, George, you might not get your voice back. Not partially, not with limitations. You might lose it completely. That night, sitting in the darkness of his home, George whispered to Norma something he had never said aloud before. What if this is how it ends? What if my voice is just gone? Norma, who had been his anchor through every storm since they were teenagers, responded with the same quiet strength she'd shown for 40 years. Then we fight, and we fight like we always have, together. The recovery period forced him to cancel shows for the first time in his career, and the guilt of disappointing fans who had bought tickets months in advance ate at him in ways physical pain never could. He underwent intensive therapy, complete vocal rest that meant weeks without speaking above a whisper, and treatments designed to heal vocal cords that had been pushed far beyond their natural limits. When he finally returned to performing, his voice had recovered, but something had shifted in his awareness. He now understood with brutal clarity that the instrument he'd relied on his entire adult life was not indestructible. That time and use were extracting a toll that couldn't be ignored forever. But the voice was only the beginning. By 2014, after decades of horseback riding on his ranch, countless hours standing on stages, and the cumulative impact of long-haul travel in buses and planes, George's back began sending signals that escalated from discomfort to genuine agony. At first, it was stiffness that lingered longer than it should, a tightness in his lower spine that made bending over to pick up his guitar case an ordeal. Then came the stabbing jolts, sudden sharp pains that would shoot down his legs without warning, making him grab onto whatever was nearby just to stay upright. Some mornings, he couldn't straighten his body fully without assistance. The pain would wake him in the night, a burning numbness that spread across his lower back and refused to release its grip no matter how he shifted position. Norma began finding him in the early morning hours, sitting on the edge of their bed, with his head in his hands, trying to breathe through waves of pain that made sleep impossible. She became his quiet guardian during this period, warming towels for his back before dawn, massaging ointment into muscles that had locked into painful knots, bracing her shoulder beneath his arm to help lift him inch by inch from the mattress on mornings when his body simply wouldn't cooperate. The first major concert postponement came in 2018, and it devastated him in ways the physical pain never could. George Strait had built a reputation over 40 years as the most reliable performer in country music, the man who showed up no matter what, who never canceled, who treated every ticket holder's investment of time and money as a sacred contract. Breaking that contract, even for legitimate medical reasons, felt like a personal failure. The statement released to fans was professional and brief, but behind it was a man grappling with the reality that his body was no longer willing to maintain the pace he'd set for himself since 1981. More postponements followed in 2021, then 2023, then 2024, each one forcing George to confront the uncomfortable truth that the war between his will and his physical limitations was one he couldn't win through determination alone. Medical evaluations revealed degenerative changes in his spine consistent with decades of physical stress, conditions that don't heal with rest because they're not injuries, but the inevitable consequences of time and use. Physical therapists worked with him to develop strategies for managing pain and maintaining mobility. But everyone involved understood the fundamental problem. George's body had been pushed to its absolute limits for 50 years, and now it was demanding a reckoning. The exercises helped, the medications managed the worst of the pain, but nothing could reverse the underlying deterioration. His doctors were honest with him about the trajectory, explaining that if he continued performing at his current pace, the damage would accelerate, potentially to the point where he couldn't walk without assistance, much less stand on stage for hours at a time. Yet even with that knowledge, even understanding the risks, George couldn't imagine stopping completely, because performing wasn't just his job or his identity. It was the thing that had saved him from drowning in grief when his daughter died. The thing that gave structure and meaning to a life that had been marked by so much loss. By 2024, a new reality had set in backstage at every show. Before stepping into the lights, George went through a ritual that fans never saw. Slow, careful stretches to loosen a spine that had stiffened during the day. Deep breathing exercises to manage pain that medication could only dull, not eliminate, and mental preparation for the physical ordeal that each performance had become. His band members, who had worked with him for years, learned to watch for subtle signs that he was struggling. The way his jaw would clench when a particular movement sent pain shooting through his back. The slight adjustment in his stance when he needed to shift weight off a leg that was threatening to give out. They never mentioned these observations publicly because George's pride wouldn't allow acknowledgement of weakness, but they stayed alert, ready to adjust arrangements or cover for him if the pain became too severe to hide. The Phoenix show in 2025, the one that started this story, represented the culmination of all these accumulating issues. That bolt of pain that nearly dropped him mid-song wasn't a new problem, but the intensification of a condition that had been building for years. What made that moment different was the crowd's reaction. When George steadied himself and kept singing, the 70,000 people in attendance erupted in a roar that felt like the earth itself rising to support him. They didn't know the specifics of what he was battling, but somehow they sensed that they were witnessing an act of pure will. A man refusing to surrender to physical limitations, even when surrender would have been completely justified. That response, that wall of sound and support from strangers, who had connected with his music over decades, gave George something his doctors and therapists couldn't provide, a reason to keep fighting that transcended his own pride or stubbornness. He was fighting for them too, for everyone who had found solace in his songs during their own darkest moments, and that obligation felt sacred in ways he struggled to articulate. The loss that changed everything to truly understand why George Strait continues to push his body beyond reasonable limits, why he refuses to step away from the stage even as pain mounts and age presses in. You have to go back to one day, June 25, 1986. That was the day his life split cleanly into before and after. The day a wound opened that never healed and quietly shaped every decision he made afterward. Jennifer Lynn Strait was 13 years old. She was bright, curious, and alive in that fragile way that makes parents feel both overwhelming pride and constant fear because the world feels too big and too dangerous for someone so young and precious. That evening, Jennifer was excited to go out with friends. Nothing unusual, just a normal teenage outing. The kind parents learn to allow even as every instinct urges them to say no. George was in another room when he heard her voice call out from the doorway. "Just a short ride, Mom. I'll be back soon." He called back without thinking, the way parents do in ordinary moments that seem unimportant at the time. "Be careful, Jen." She smiled, an innocent, reassuring smile that parents replay forever after tragedy, searching for meaning, for warning signs, for anything they missed. None of them knew that was the last time they would see her alive. Somewhere along a familiar Texas road, everything changed in an instant. The car Jennifer was riding in gained more speed than the young driver could control. A curve tightened, tires lost grip, and in one merciless second, fate delivered its blow. The vehicle crashed. Jennifer, seated in the front passenger seat, suffered injuries too severe to survive. She was gone before emergency responders could arrive, before her parents even knew she was in danger, before any desperate what-ifs had the chance to matter. For George and Norma, the nightmare began with a phone call. The ring cut through their evening like a blade. George answered, expecting something routine, a friend, a band member, anything ordinary. Instead, a trembling voice delivered words that stopped time. "There's been an accident. It's Jennifer. You need to come right away." Across the room, Norma watched George's face drain of color, saw his knees buckle slightly as he clutched the phone. She knew before he spoke that their world had just ended. The drive to the hospital exists in George's memory only in fragments. Norma's hand crushing his, as if they could anchor each other against a reality already slipping away. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room, too bright and too cold. The unbearable pause before a doctor approached them, compassion written across his face before his words confirmed what they already feared but could not accept. "We did everything we could. I'm so sorry she didn't make it." Something inside George broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a foundation cracking beneath a house that still looks intact from the outside. Norma collapsed, her body giving way all at once, and George caught her even as his own strength faltered. They stood together in that sterile hallway while the world continued moving, indifferent to the devastation that had just destroyed their lives. The days that followed barely registered as days at all. Time passed without meaning. Jennifer's bedroom door stayed closed, not in denial, but because opening it meant confronting her absence. Her books sat on the nightstand. Her jacket still hung over a chair. The faint scent of her shampoo lingered on fabrics she would never touch again. Norma sometimes stood outside that door with her fingertips resting against the wood, as if keeping it closed preserved some part of her daughter. Bubba, only 5 years old, moved quietly through the house, instinctively careful, sensing his parents were breaking without understanding why. The funeral took place beneath a Texas sky that felt vast and indifferent. Friends and family gathered to show support, but for George and Norma, the world had narrowed to one small casket. George stood trembling, clutching his Stetson to his chest, as if holding his shattered heart in his hands. When it came time to leave, Norma rested her hand on the casket one last time and whispered something only a mother can whisper. A promise, a plea, a goodbye no parent should ever have to say. Walking away felt like abandoning Jennifer all over again. George later said those first steps back to the car were the hardest of his life. Then came the cruel paradox of grief and fame colliding. The world did not stop. Contracts remained. Tours resumed. Within weeks, George was expected back on stage. Night after night, he walked into lights and applause, smiling and performing while hollowed out inside. Only Norma saw the truth. Him sitting backstage with his head in his hands, terrified his voice would crack, not from strain, but from grief. Years later, George admitted he didn't know if he would ever sing again, not because of vocal damage, but because he didn't know how to pretend to be whole. What saved him was the same thing that had saved him as a boy when his mother left: music. Singing didn't heal the pain, and it didn't erase it, but it allowed him to breathe. The stage became survival. Each song carried his grief, giving it somewhere to exist without destroying him. Norma understood this and encouraged him to keep going, knowing the music was keeping him alive. In time, George and Norma transformed their loss into purpose. They founded the Jennifer Lynn Strait Foundation, quietly donating millions to children's charities and causes Jennifer would have cared about. George rarely speaks about it publicly, but the foundation stands as proof that Jennifer's life mattered, that even in unimaginable loss, something meaningful could still be built. And that is why George Strait keeps singing. The accumulation of loss. If losing Jennifer taught George Strait that life could be mercilessly cruel, the losses that followed over the next 3 decades drove that lesson into him with relentless force. Death didn't arrive gently or give him time to recover between blows. It came in waves, each one crashing before the last had fully receded, threatening to pull him under completely. In 2009, 23 years after burying his daughter, George received another phone call that split his world open. His older brother, Buddy Strait, had collapsed suddenly from an undiagnosed coronary condition. He was only 58 years old. There was no warning, no chance for a final conversation, no time to prepare. George was in a Nashville studio when the call came. Those present later said he went unnaturally still, phone pressed to his ear, color draining from his face. Without a word, he set down his guitar and walked out. Music, for once, could not carry him through the moment. Buddy was more than a brother. He was the keeper of shared history. The only other person alive who remembered their childhood in the same raw, unfiltered way. He had stood beside 9-year-old George the day their mother left, frozen in confusion, trying to be strong when no child should have to be. He worked alongside George on their father's ranch during those silent years when responsibility replaced innocence, when 3 straight men quietly held together a household that had collapsed. Buddy carried the jokes, the memories, the understanding that exist only between people who survived the same wounds. Standing over Buddy's casket, George felt something extinguish inside him. Not just grief, but the sudden realization that he was now alone with certain truths. He was the last witness to parts of his own childhood. the last living record of moments no one else could fully understand or remember. That isolation pressed down on him heavily, a loneliness deeper than fame could ever reach. Barely a year later, loss returned. In 2010, Doris Strait, the mother who had walked out on George and Buddy when they were children, began slipping away after a long illness. Their relationship had never fully healed. George had carried the wound of her abandonment for decades, even as success and fame insulated him from many ordinary hardships. Somewhere inside him still lived the 9-year-old boy watching his mother leave, wondering what he had done wrong, why he hadn't been enough to make her stay. As Doris declined, something unexpected happened. George visited her whenever his touring schedule allowed. He sat beside her hospital bed, in a silence unlike the quiet meals of his childhood. This silence was heavy with things that needed to be said before time ran out entirely. One afternoon, as her breathing grew shallow and uneven, George took her fragile hand and spoke words he had carried for more than 50 years. "I forgive you, Mom." They were simple words, but they cost him everything to say. They didn't change the past. They didn't erase the damage, but they loosened something tight and poisonous that had lived in him for half a century. Doris squeezed his fingers with what little strength she had left. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no perfect ending, just two damaged people acknowledging the pain between them and giving each other permission to let go. When Doris died shortly after, George grieved not only for the mother he had lost twice, once through abandonment, once through death, but also for the years they could never recover. Just as he was learning to carry that complicated grief, another loss arrived, one that cut deeper than anything except Jennifer's death. In 2013, George's father, John Byron Strait Sr., entered a sudden decline after years of quietly battling failing health. Like many men of his generation, John never complained, never asked for help, never allowed weakness to show. George spent countless nights at the hospital, surrounded by the steady beep of monitors and the hiss of oxygen, the room feeling too small for the enormity of what was ending. One evening, during a brutal rainstorm that battered the windows, George leaned close to his father's bed and whispered words that felt inadequate but necessary. "You did good, Dad. You carried us through everything. You raised us right when Mom left, and it was just the three of us." John opened his eyes, exhausted but clear, for one final moment. What passed between them didn't need words. They had spent a lifetime communicating through action rather than language. It was the last moment of real clarity they would share. When John finally passed, the grief crushed George in a way that surprised even him. Losing his father hurt in a way that was different, but somehow heavier. John had been the final root, the last living connection to George's childhood, to who he was before fame complicated everything. His death made George an orphan, even at 61 years old. Those foundational relationships don't stop mattering just because you grow older. Without his father, George felt unmoored, as if gravity itself had weakened. The man who had stood unshaken before millions of fans, who had survived poverty, rejection, and devastating loss, suddenly felt small again, like a child in an aging body realizing he was now the oldest generation in his family, the one responsible for carrying forward everything his father had built and believed. By the time the dust settled, George Strait had buried his daughter, his brother, his mother, and his father. The accumulation of loss reshaped him quietly and permanently. And yet, somehow, he kept standing, not untouched by grief, but forged by it. The empire built from pain. So here's George Strait at 73, A body that's breaking down, a heart that's buried more loved ones than seems survivable, and a career that has made him one of the most successful and wealthy artists in American entertainment history. The contrast is staggering and reveals something profound about how success and suffering coexist in the same life. George's estimated net worth now approaches $300 million, a figure that feels surreal when held against the memory of the young ranch kid who once counted loose change with Norma just to afford groceries, who lived off canned beans and ramen in a freezing San Marcos apartment, who slept in a band van because motel rooms were an unaffordable luxury. He has sold more albums than any country artist in history, 69 million sold in the US alone, has earned more #1 hits than any artist in any genre, and has filled stadiums that most performers can only dream about. In 2014, he set the record for the largest indoor concert in American history at that time, packing 104,793 fans into AT&T Stadium. In 2024, he broke his own record with 110,905 people at Kyle Field. These numbers represent something beyond commercial success. They represent millions of people who have connected with his music, who have found in his voice and songs something that speaks to their own experiences of love and loss and survival. At the heart of his financial success once stood his legendary hilltop estate in San Antonio, designed by renowned architect Bill Tull over 3 years of meticulous planning. The property sprawled across 12 acres with adobe-inspired walls, 14 fireplaces, and an infinity pool that seemed to spill over the edge of the Texas hills into endless sky. Though George eventually sold the estate, it remains one of the most extraordinary celebrity residences Texas has ever seen. A testament to how far he traveled from that small ranch house where 3 straight men tried to hold together a world that had collapsed when his mother left. But here's what matters about George's wealth. He's never flaunted it, never used it to separate himself from the people who made his success possible, never treated it as anything more than a tool to protect his family and maintain the privacy that allows him to survive the pressures of fame. His current life is divided between ranch properties, where he can ride horses when his back allows, a lake retreat where family gathers for simple celebrations, and the quiet routines that keep him grounded. For decades, George has been a licensed pilot, flying his own Gulfstream G450, a long-range jet capable of crossing continents. To outsiders, it looks like the ultimate symbol of celebrity excess. But to George, it's a lifeline, a way to finish a concert and be home with Norma the same night, instead of spending days on the road away from the person who keeps him sane. It's a tool for compressing the space between his public and private lives, for maintaining the marriage that has anchored him through every storm. His personal world today is centered entirely on family. Bubba, now a grown man with children of his own, has become not just George's son, but a guardian of the family's legacy. He's an accomplished songwriter and rodeo competitor in his own right, carrying forward the Strait name while building his own identity separate from his father's shadow. Family gatherings at George's properties are simple and warm, despite the wealth surrounding them. Children racing through hallways, fishing lines dropped into quiet lakes, the smell of grilled suppers drifting across wide porches. These are the moments George lives for now, the ordinary joys that money can't buy, but can protect from the intrusions of fame. In recent years, George has spoken more openly about estate planning, about ensuring that the wealth he's accumulated serves his family long after he's gone. He's establishing trust structures designed to protect his children and grandchildren's futures, while preserving the values he holds sacred: humility, responsibility, devotion to family, and the understanding that money is a tool for security and freedom, not a measure of worth. He wants his grandchildren to grow up with the same work ethic he learned on his father's ranch, the same understanding that nothing worthwhile comes easily, the same resilience that carried him through rejection and loss. The wealth is a safety net, not a replacement for character, and George is determined to ensure that distinction remains clear across generations. The man behind the music. So what do we make of George Strait at 73? This man who has spent 5 decades turning his pain into music that millions carry in their hearts. He stands before us as living proof that survival is possible even when life delivers more loss than seems bearable. That strength isn't about never breaking, but about continuing to stand after you've shattered, about finding reasons to keep going when every logical calculation says surrender would be easier. His voice, threatened by time and use, still carries the weight of everything he's survived. His body, worn down by decades of pushing beyond reasonable limits, still carries him onto stages where he refuses to surrender. His heart, broken by losses that would have destroyed weaker people, still finds room for love and gratitude and the quiet grace that defines his final chapter. Every time George Strait steps into those lights, despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, despite having earned the right to retire into comfortable obscurity, he's demonstrating something profound about human resilience. He's showing us that the measure of a life isn't found in the absence of suffering, but in what we build from the ruins, in how we honor the people we've lost by continuing to live fully, even when that living hurts. The Phoenix show in 2025, that moment when pain nearly dropped him but he straightened and kept singing, encapsulates everything about who George Strait is. He's the 9-year-old boy watching his mother leave, the broke college kid wondering if his dream is worth the hunger, the father standing over his daughter's casket. The son is burying his brother, his mother, his father, the man whose body is failing but whose will refuses to acknowledge defeat. Every note he sings now carries all of that history, all of that loss, all of that determination to keep standing when the world keeps taking everything you love. And when those 70,000 fans erupted in support as he fought through that pain, they weren't just cheering for a performer. They were witnessing something sacred, a man refusing to let circumstance define him, choosing over and over again to transform suffering into something beautiful and lasting. When the lights go dark and the crowd disappears, the real story begins. George Strait's life reminds us that survival isn't proven on stage, but in the silence that follows, when pain lingers and choices still have to be made. His music endures because the fight behind it never truly stopped, and it still hasn't. The question now isn't what he's survived, but what comes next, when the strength finally meets its limits, and when your own moment arrives. Will you keep standing? Or will you let the silence decide for you?